The morning sun was just beginning to peek over the buildings of downtown Millers Creek when Harold Matthews slowly made his way down Oak Street. At 93 years old, he moved carefully but with purpose, his worn wooden cane tapping gently against the concrete sidewalk. Every morning, rain or shine, Harold followed the same path to Jenny's diner, just as he had done for the past 30 years. The small bell above the diner's door chimed as Harold pushed it open at exactly 7:15 a.m. The familiar smell of fresh coffee and bacon filled the air, bringing a gentle smile to his weathered face. The morning regulars, mostly factory workers and early-rising office employees, all knew Harold by now. Some nodded in greeting, while others called out good morning to the elderly veteran. "Your usual spot is waiting for you, Mr. Matthews," Sarah, the young waitress with kind eyes and auburn hair, called out. She had only been working at the diner for 2 years, but she treated Harold like her own grandfather. The corner booth by the window had been unofficially reserved for Harold since 1994, when the previous owner, Jenny herself, had declared it the Veterans Corner. Harold carefully placed his navy blue veteran's cap on the table before sliding into the worn red leather booth. The morning sunlight streamed through the large window, warming his face and illuminating the small American flag pin on his beige jacket. His arthritic fingers slowly unbuttoned his jacket, revealing a neatly pressed plaid shirt underneath. "Black coffee and whole wheat toast with strawberry jam coming right up," Sarah said, already pouring his coffee into his favorite mug. A slightly chipped white ceramic cup with an American flag on it. The diner had tried to replace it several times with newer ones, but Harold politely declined each time. That cup had been his constant companion for breakfasts since his wife Martha passed away in 1992. As he waited for his toast, Harold pulled out his small leather wallet. Inside, behind the clear plastic window, was a faded photograph of a young man in military uniform sitting proudly on a motorcycle. The edges of the photo were worn smooth from years of handling, but the pride in the young soldier's eyes was still clearly visible. Harold touched the photo gently, remembering the weight of his helmet, the rumble of the motorcycle engine, and the important missions he had carried out across enemy lines. The other regular customers knew not to disturb Harold during this part of his morning routine. For 15 minutes each day, he would sit in quiet contemplation, looking at his old photographs and sipping his coffee. Some of the newer customers had tried to strike up conversations during this time, but the regulars would quietly explain that this was Harold's personal time, a moment of remembrance and reflection. Sarah returned with his toast, perfectly browned and spread with just the right amount of strawberry jam, cut diagonally just the way he liked it. "Here you go, Mr. Matthews. I made sure they gave you the good jam today," she said with a warm smile, knowing Harold could tell the difference between the regular jam and the special homemade preserves that Jenny's daughter sometimes brought to the diner. Harold carefully folded his wallet and placed it back in his jacket pocket. "Thank you, Sarah," he said softly, his voice carrying the gentle weight of his years. "You're a good girl, just like Jenny was." Sarah beamed at the compliment, knowing that being compared to Jenny was the highest praise Harold could give. The morning continued peacefully as Harold ate his toast with small, deliberate bites. He watched the town come to life through the large window beside him, shop owners flipping their signs from closed to open, school buses beginning their routes, and people hurrying to work with coffee cups in hand. This was his favorite part of the day, when everything felt normal and right with the world. Little did Harold know that this peaceful morning routine was about to change dramatically. The familiar rhythm of his days was about to be disrupted by the arrival of unexpected visitors who would test his patience, challenge his dignity, and ultimately lead to one of the most surprising chapters of his long and eventful life. The peaceful atmosphere of Jenny's diner changed forever on a Tuesday morning in early spring. Harold had just settled into his usual corner booth when the ground seemed to shake with the rumble of approaching motorcycles. The sound grew louder until 5 massive bikes pulled into the diner's parking lot, their chrome parts gleaming in the morning sun. The bell above the door chimed aggressively as the bikers entered, their heavy boots thudding against the worn linoleum floor. They called themselves the Thunder Raiders, and their leather jackets displayed their gang logo, a silver lightning bolt striking through a skull. The leader, a tall man with a thick beard and arms covered in tattoos, went by the name Spike. Sarah, the waitress, gripped her coffee pot tighter as the bikers sprawled across 2 booths near Harold's corner. Their loud laughter and rough language filled the usually quiet morning air. Several regular customers glanced nervously at each other, while others quickly finished their meals and left. "Hey, Grandpa," Spike called out to Harold, his voice carrying a mocking tone. "Isn't it past your bedtime?" The other bikers snickered, their eyes fixed on the elderly veteran who continued to sip his coffee calmly. Harold's hands trembled slightly as he raised his coffee cup, but his face remained composed. He had faced far worse than playground bullies during the war. Still, the intrusion into his peaceful morning routine was unsettling. Day after day, the Thunder Raiders returned. They seemed to take special pleasure in disturbing Harold's morning ritual. They would rev their engines extra loud when passing his window, make exaggerated imitations of his careful movements, and whisper loud enough for him to hear their cruel jokes about old-timers' disease and senior moments. Sarah tried her best to protect Harold. She would intentionally take longer to serve the bikers, sometimes accidentally forgetting parts of their orders. But her small acts of defiance only seemed to amuse them more. One morning, a younger biker named Snake decided to up the ante. He walked past Harold's table, deliberately bumping it hard enough to make the coffee splash over the sides of Harold's cup. "Oops," Snake said with fake concern. "Guess your hands aren't as steady as they used to be, old man." The other customers watched in tense silence. Mr. Johnson, the hardware store owner, half rose from his seat, ready to intervene, but Harold caught his eye and slightly shook his head. The veteran calmly picked up his napkin and began to wipe up the spilled coffee. The harassment continued for weeks. The Thunder Raiders would take turns sitting in booths near Harold, making snoring sounds when he looked at his old photographs or asking him loudly if he needed help cutting his toast into smaller pieces so he wouldn't choke. What bothered Harold most wasn't their childish behavior. It was the way they treated their motorcycles. He could hear them racing recklessly through town, and from his window seat, he often saw them neglecting basic maintenance on their bikes. As a former military motorcycle scout, it pained him to see such powerful machines being treated with so little respect. The situation reached its peak one particularly busy morning. The diner was full of customers when the Thunder Raiders arrived, louder and more aggressive than usual. They had just won a small-town motorcycle rally and were feeling especially bold. Spike swaggered over to Harold's table, picked up his coffee cup, and took a long drink before placing it back down with an exaggerated grimace. "Don't know how you drink this stuff, Black, old-timer," Spike sneered. "Maybe we should order you a nice warm glass of milk instead." The diner fell completely silent. Even the kitchen staff stopped what they were doing to watch. Sarah stood frozen by the counter, coffee pot in hand, her face pale with worry. The other bikers leaned forward in their seats, grinning in anticipation of Harold's reaction. But what happened next would change everything. Instead of showing fear or anger, a strange glimmer appeared in Harold's faded blue eyes. He slowly folded his newspaper, placed it carefully on the table, and for the first time since the Thunder Raiders had started coming to the diner, he turned to fully face them with a mysterious smile playing at the corners of his mouth. The mysterious smile on Harold's face stirred something in Sarah's memory. Last Christmas, during a quiet moment in the diner, Harold had shown her an old leather-bound album he kept in his apartment above Miller's bookstore. Now, watching him face the Thunder Raiders, she remembered the remarkable photographs she had seen that day. The truth was, Harold Matthews wasn't just any World War II veteran. In 1943, at the age of 22, he had been specially selected for an elite motorcycle reconnaissance unit known as the Ghost Riders. These brave soldiers carried out some of the most dangerous missions of the war, riding their specially modified Harley-Davidson WLA motorcycles behind enemy lines to gather crucial intelligence. Harold had been one of the best. His commanding officer had nicknamed him Shadow because of his ability to slip in and out of enemy territory without being detected. The young Harold had modified his own motorcycle, adding special features that made it quieter and more maneuverable than standard military bikes. He could handle a motorcycle at high speeds on any terrain, from muddy forest paths to narrow mountain roads. During one particularly important mission in 1944, Harold had ridden through a heavy thunderstorm to deliver vital information about enemy positions. The mission had earned him a Silver Star, though he never talked about it. The medal now sat in a small box in his apartment, along with his other military decorations. The old photograph in his wallet that he looked at every morning wasn't just any military picture. It showed him with his beloved motorcycle after completing that dangerous mission. The young Harold in the photo was covered in mud but smiling proudly, one hand resting on his motorcycle's handlebar while the other held his helmet. Even now, at 93, Harold's hands still remembered every control, every gear shift, every subtle adjustment needed to handle a powerful motorcycle. Sometimes, late at night, he would dream of those rides, the wind in his face, the powerful engine beneath him, and the incredible sense of freedom that came with mastering such a magnificent machine. Sarah had seen other photographs in his album too. There was one of Harold teaching other soldiers advanced riding techniques, and another of him repairing motorcycles in a makeshift workshop near the front lines. He hadn't just been a rider, he had been an instructor and a skilled mechanic as well. The Thunder Raiders had no idea that the old man they were mocking had forgotten more about motorcycles than they had ever known. Harold could tell by the sound of their engines that their bikes needed proper tuning. He had noticed their improper riding posture, their rough handling of the clutch, and their poor maintenance habits. Every time they roared past the diner, he could identify at least 3 things they were doing wrong. As Harold sat there, memories of his Ghost Rider days flooded back. He remembered the brotherhood he had shared with his fellow riders, the respect they had shown for their machines and each other, and the code of honor they had lived by. These young bikers, with all their noise and swagger, were nothing like the true riders he had known. The Thunder Raiders mistook Harold's slight smile for fear or confusion. Spike, their leader, leaned closer to Harold's table, trying to intimidate the elderly man. But for the first time since they had started coming to the diner, Harold didn't look away. Instead, his faded blue eyes held a glint of steel that made Spike blink in surprise. In that moment, Harold made a decision. Perhaps it was time to teach these young troublemakers a lesson about respect, about real riding, and about judging a book by its cover. His days as a ghost rider might be long past, but some skills never truly fade away. Harold's gnarled fingers, which had been quietly resting on his cane, now gripped it with renewed purpose. The same hands that had once guided a military motorcycle through enemy territory were about to show these young bikers that age was just a number, and that true mastery never grows old. As the morning sun streamed through the diner's window, highlighting the small American flag pin on his jacket, Harold prepared to make an unexpected request that would leave the Thunder Raiders, and everyone else in Jenny's diner, completely speechless. The morning started like any other at Jenny's diner, but there was tension in the air. The Thunder Raiders had arrived earlier than usual, their motorcycles lined up outside like dark threats. The regular customers watched nervously as the bikers seemed more restless than usual, pushing tables together and laughing louder than ever. Harold sat in his usual corner booth, his coffee getting cold as he studied the old photograph in his wallet. The young soldier in the picture seemed to stare back at him with knowing eyes, as if reminding him of who he once was. Outside, dark clouds gathered, matching the mood inside the diner. Spike, the gang's leader, was showing off a new leather jacket to his fellow bikers. The price tag was still hanging from one sleeve, and he bragged about how much it cost. His voice carried across the diner, deliberately loud enough for everyone to hear. The other bikers nodded and praised the jacket, their voices mixing with the clatter of plates and the sizzle of the grill. Sarah tried to move quickly past their table, but Snake stuck out his foot, nearly making her trip. She managed to keep her balance, but some coffee splashed from her pot onto the floor. The bikers erupted in laughter, pointing at her reddening face. "Watch your step, sweetheart," Snake called out, high-fiving his friends. "Floor's a bit slippery." Harold's hands tightened around his coffee cup. He had seen enough bullying during the war to recognize it in any form. His military training had taught him to choose his battles wisely, but it had also taught him when to take a stand. The situation escalated when Spike stood up and stretched, his new jacket creaking. He walked over to Harold's booth, his heavy boots thudding against the floor. The diner grew quiet, except for the soft music playing from the old jukebox in the corner. "Hey, old-timer," Spike said, leaning over Harold's table. "What's that you're always staring at? Love letter from your girlfriend." He reached for the wallet in Harold's hands, but Harold calmly closed it and slipped it into his jacket pocket. "Some things deserve respect," Harold said quietly, his voice steady despite his age. Spike's face darkened. He grabbed Harold's coffee cup and held it up, examining it in the light. "Nice mug you got here. American flag and everything. Real patriotic." Then, with a cruel smile, he deliberately tipped the cup, letting the coffee spill across Harold's table. The dark liquid spread across the wooden surface, soaking Harold's paper napkins and running toward the edge of the table. Sarah gasped from behind the counter. Mr. Johnson, the hardware store owner, half rose from his seat again, but Harold caught his eye just like before. The other bikers watched, grinning and nudging each other, waiting to see how the old man would react. They expected tears, anger, or fear. Instead, they saw something entirely different. Harold Matthews, former Ghost Rider and Silver Star recipient, slowly stood up. His movements were careful but deliberate, like a soldier preparing for battle. He reached for his cane, but there was something different about the way he held it now, more like a soldier holding a weapon than an elderly man seeking support. The morning sun broke through the clouds outside, sending a shaft of light through the diner's window. It caught the American flag pin on Harold's jacket, making it shine like a beacon. His blue eyes, usually soft with age, now held a sharp gleam that made Spike take an involuntary step backward. "Young man," Harold said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent diner, "I believe it's time we have a serious talk about respect, motorcycles, and making assumptions." He paused, letting his words sink in. "But first, I have a request that might interest you and your friends." The Thunder Raiders exchanged confused looks. This wasn't the reaction they had expected. The old man they had been bullying for weeks was suddenly standing straight and tall, his presence filling the diner with an authority they couldn't quite understand. Harold's next words would change everything, but first, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something that made everyone in the diner lean forward in curiosity. From his jacket pocket, Harold pulled out an old, worn leather wallet, but instead of money, he carefully removed a folded piece of paper that had turned yellow with age. As he unfolded it with steady hands, everyone in Jenny's diner could see it was some kind of military document, with official stamps and seals clearly visible. "This," Harold said, holding up the paper, "is my certification as a military motorcycle instructor from 1944. Never thought I'd need to show it again, but times change." His voice carried a quiet confidence that made even the loudest of the Thunder Raiders lean in to listen. Spike crossed his arms, trying to look unimpressed. "What's that got to do with anything, old man?" But there was a hint of uncertainty in his voice now, a crack in his usual arrogant tone. Harold carefully refolded the document and placed it back in his wallet. "I have a proposition for you and your friends," he said, looking directly at Spike. "A challenge, if you're interested." The other customers in the diner had completely forgotten about their meals. Sarah stood frozen behind the counter, coffee pot still in hand, her eyes wide with anticipation. Even the cook had stepped out from the kitchen to watch. "If I can prove that I can still handle a motorcycle better than any of you," Harold continued, his voice growing stronger with each word, "you'll stop harassing the people in this diner. And," he paused for effect, "you'll escort me to the Veterans Memorial every Sunday morning." The Thunder Raiders burst out laughing, but their laughter had a nervous edge to it. Snake elbowed one of his friends. "Hey, maybe we should call an ambulance now, save time later." But his joke fell flat as Harold continued to stand there, calm and unwavering. "And if you lose?" Spike asked, trying to regain control of the situation. "What do we get?" Harold reached up and unpinned the small American flag from his jacket. "This pin was given to me by General Eisenhower himself after a special mission. If I lose, it's yours." He held up the pin, letting it catch the morning light. "Along with my word that I'll never come back to this diner." A collective gasp went through the room. Everyone knew how much the pin meant to Harold, how he touched it every morning when he said his quiet prayer of remembrance. "You're serious?" Spike's voice had lost its mocking tone. He looked at the small pin with newfound respect, understanding its significance. "As serious as I was in 1944, Harold replied. "We'll set up a course in the parking lot behind the diner. This Sunday at 10 a.m., you bring your best bike, and I'll show you what real riding looks like." The diner erupted in excited whispers. Mr. Johnson stepped forward, his voice firm. "I'll be the judge. Keep everything fair and square." Other regular customers quickly volunteered to help set up the course and serve as witnesses. Spike looked around at his fellow bikers, then back at Harold. The old man's quiet confidence was unsettling. For the first time since they'd started coming to the diner, the Thunder Raiders looked uncertain. "Deal," Spike finally said, extending his hand. "But don't expect us to go easy on you because of your age." Harold shook Spike's hand with a grip that surprised the younger man. "I wouldn't have it any other way," he said with a slight smile. "And one more thing." He paused, making sure he had everyone's attention. "Your bikes need tuning. I can hear it in the engines. Might want to fix that before Sunday." The Thunder Raiders looked at each other in surprise. How did he know about their bikes? Who was this old man really? As the bikers filed out of the diner, looking less confident than when they entered, Sarah approached Harold's table with a fresh cup of coffee. "Are you sure about this, Mr. Matthews?" she asked quietly, worry clear in her voice. Harold sat back down in his booth, his eyes following the bikers as they mounted their motorcycles outside. "Sometimes, Sarah," he said softly, "the best way to earn respect is to give someone the chance to learn it for themselves." He picked up his coffee cup with a steady hand, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "And I think these young men are about to learn a very interesting lesson." Sunday morning arrived with perfect weather for motorcycle riding. The sun shone brightly in a cloudless sky as a crowd gathered in the parking lot behind Jenny's diner. Word had spread quickly through the small town, and it seemed like everyone had come to watch the challenge. The Thunder Raiders arrived early, their motorcycles freshly washed and tuned. They had taken Harold's advice seriously. Spike's black Harley-Davidson gleamed in the morning sun, its chrome parts polished to mirror brightness. The bike he had chosen for Harold to ride was his personal pride and joy. Mr. Johnson and several other townspeople had spent Saturday setting up the course. Orange traffic cones marked a complex path that included tight turns, slalom sections, and even a few challenging obstacles. Small flags marked the spots where riders would need to demonstrate specific skills. At exactly 10 a.m., a familiar tap-tap sound made everyone turn. Harold was walking toward the crowd, but he looked different today. Instead of his usual beige jacket, he wore an old leather riding jacket that, despite its age, had been carefully maintained. The patches on its sleeves told stories of his military service, and a Ghost Rider's insignia was still visible on the back. "Didn't know they made motorcycle jackets that old," Snake whispered to his friends, but his usual mocking tone was missing. There was something about Harold's appearance that commanded respect. Sarah handed Harold a cup of his usual black coffee, which he sipped calmly while Mr. Johnson explained the rules. The course had to be completed within 5 minutes, with penalties for touching cones or missing markers. Each rider would get one practice run and one timed run. "Age before beauty," Spike said with a smirk, gesturing to his motorcycle. "You're up first, old-timer." Harold handed his coffee cup to Sarah and walked over to Spike's motorcycle. His movements were deliberate but sure. He ran his hand along the bike's handlebar, checking the controls with the expertise of someone who knew exactly what to look for. "When was the last time you rode?" one of the bikers called out nervously. "About 50 years ago," Harold replied with a slight smile, "but some things you never forget." The crowd held their breath as Harold swung his leg over the motorcycle with surprising grace. He adjusted his position, and suddenly the years seemed to fall away from him. His back straightened, his hands found the controls naturally, and his whole demeanor changed. When he started the engine, something remarkable happened. Instead of the loud roar the Thunder Raiders were known for, the motorcycle purred to life with a smooth, controlled sound. Harold had adjusted the throttle perfectly, showing a touch that spoke of years of experience. For his practice run, Harold took the course slowly, learning the bike's responses and studying the layout. The Thunder Raiders exchanged confident looks, thinking the old man was being too cautious, but Mr. Johnson, who had served in the military himself, recognized what Harold was doing. He was strategizing, just like he had done on his reconnaissance missions. When the time came for the actual run, Harold's transformation was complete. The elderly man from the diner was gone, replaced by a skilled rider who seemed to become one with the machine. He moved through the starting line with precision, and what happened next left everyone speechless. Harold guided the motorcycle through the course with incredible skill. His turns were perfect, his balance impeccable. He maneuvered through the slalom section as if the heavy bike was a lightweight bicycle, never touching a single cone. In the tight turns, he used techniques that none of the Thunder Raiders had seen before, old military motorcycle handling skills that had been developed for wartime precision. The crowd watched in amazement as Harold smoothly navigated each obstacle. Adults were cheering, children were jumping up and down with excitement, and even the Thunder Raiders stood open-mouthed as the old veteran demonstrated riding skills they hadn't known existed. As Harold approached the final section of the course, he did something that made everyone gasp. Instead of taking the simple approach, he executed a perfect military motorcycle maneuver, one that had been used by the Ghost Riders to evade enemy patrols. The bike responded to his commands as if it had been waiting all its life for a rider who truly understood it. As Harold brought the motorcycle to a perfect stop at the finish line, the crowd erupted in thunderous applause. Mr. Johnson checked his stopwatch and shook his head in disbelief. Harold had completed the course in half the time they had allowed. But it wasn't just the speed that impressed everyone. It was the skill, the grace, and the obvious mastery he had shown. Spike walked over to his motorcycle, running his hand along the seat where Harold still sat. For the first time since anyone could remember, the Thunder Raiders' leader looked humbled. "I've had this bike for 5 years," he said quietly, "and I've never seen it handled like that." Harold dismounted with the same careful grace he had shown getting on. His old leather jacket creaked as he stretched, and a slight smile played at the corners of his mouth. "Beautiful machine you have here," he said to Spike. "The transmission is a bit tight on the left side, though. Might want to have that checked." The other Thunder Raiders gathered around, their faces showing a mixture of awe and curiosity. Snake, who had been one of the most vocal in mocking Harold, stepped forward. "Where did you learn to ride like that?" he asked, genuine respect in his voice. Harold reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an old folded photograph. It was the same one he looked at every morning in the diner, but now he held it out for the bikers to see. The image showed a young soldier sitting proudly on a military motorcycle, surrounded by other riders in uniform. "Ghost Riders," Harold said, his voice carrying clearly in the hushed parking lot. "We were a special motorcycle reconnaissance unit during World War II. Our job was to gather intelligence behind enemy lines. Had to ride fast, ride quiet, and ride smart. Our lives depended on it." The Thunder Raiders passed the photograph around carefully, treating it with a reverence they had never shown for anything before. As they looked at the young Harold in the picture, they began to understand the depth of their mistake in judging him by his age. "We modified our own bikes," Harold continued, warming to his subject. "Added special mufflers for stealth, improved the suspension for rough terrain. Every rider was also a mechanic. We learned to feel the machine, to understand it like it was part of us." Sarah appeared with fresh coffee for everyone, and Harold began sharing stories of his military missions. He told them about riding through storms, navigating mountain paths at night with no lights, and the brotherhood that developed among the Ghost Riders. The Thunder Raiders listened intently, occasionally asking questions about specific techniques they had seen him use on the course. "That last move you did," Spike said, "the one near the finish line, I'd never seen anything like it." Harold's eyes lit up. That was a standard Ghost Rider evasion technique, used at once to shake off a German patrol in France. "The trick is in the weight distribution and throttle control." He began explaining the mechanics of the maneuver, using his hands to demonstrate the movements. As Harold spoke, the Thunder Raiders found themselves drawing closer, hanging on every word. They started sharing their own riding experiences, asking for advice, and even admitting some of their struggles with certain techniques. The wall of hostility that had existed between them melted away, replaced by a genuine connection between riders of different generations. Mr. Johnson watched from the sideline, smiling as he saw the transformation taking place. The Thunder Raiders were no longer the intimidating gang that had terrorized the diner. They were becoming students, eager to learn from a master rider who had more experience than all of them combined. "Tell you what," Harold said, noting their interest. "If you're serious about improving your riding, I might be willing to share a few more Ghost Rider techniques. But first," he paused, looking each biker in the eye, "we need to talk about proper motorcycle maintenance and respect for others." The Thunder Raiders nodded eagerly, completely forgetting their former arrogance. The elderly man they had mocked for weeks had become someone they desperately wanted to learn from. As the morning sun rose higher in the sky, the parking lot behind Jenny's Diner had become more than just a challenge course. It had become a classroom where a new kind of understanding was taking root. #A new brotherhood. 3 months after the challenge in the diner's parking lot, Jenny's Diner had changed in ways nobody could have predicted. Every Sunday morning, the rumble of motorcycles would announce the arrival of the Thunder Raiders, but now they came with a different purpose. The once feared gang had become Harold's honor guard, escorting him to the Veterans Memorial with pride. The site had become a local attraction. The Thunder Raiders, their bikes polished and maintained to military standards, would line up outside the diner at exactly 9 a.m. Harold would emerge wearing his leather riding jacket, now cleaned and restored by the bikers themselves. Spike, who had once mocked the elderly veteran, now personally helped Harold onto his motorcycle, a specially modified bike that the gang had worked together to customize for their mentor. Inside the diner, the transformation was even more remarkable. The corner booth was still Harold's special place, but now it had become a gathering spot for riders young and old. Every morning, at least 2 or 3 of the Thunder Raiders would join him for coffee, eagerly listening to his stories and seeking his advice about motorcycle maintenance and riding techniques. Sarah couldn't help smiling as she watched Snake, once the most disrespectful of the group, carefully writing down Harold's instructions about proper engine timing in a notebook he had bought specifically for this purpose. The other waitresses had gotten used to hearing technical terms mixed with war stories as Harold shared his knowledge with his newfound students. The Veterans Memorial visits had evolved into something special. Other motorcycle clubs from neighboring towns had heard about Harold and the Thunder Raiders, and soon more riders began joining their Sunday processions. The line of motorcycles stretching behind Harold grew longer each week, creating a thunder that shook the streets. But now it was a sound of respect rather than intimidation. Harold had changed too. The quiet, reserved veteran still looked at his old photograph each morning, but now he would sometimes share stories about his fellow ghost riders with the young bikers. His eyes would light up as he described the special missions and the extraordinary brotherhood he had experienced during the war. The Thunder Raiders listened with rapt attention, understanding that they were hearing living history. One particular morning stood out. Spike had arrived early at the diner, carrying something wrapped in old leather. With uncharacteristic gentleness, he placed it on Harold's table. It was a restored Ghost Rider's insignia, nearly identical to the faded one on Harold's jacket. The gang had spent weeks tracking down an original patch and having it carefully preserved. We all agreed, Spike said, his voice rough with emotion. You should have a fresh one to wear. The old one's earned its retirement. The other customers in the diner pretended not to notice as Harold's eyes grew misty at the gesture. The Thunder Raiders had also started a new tradition. Every month, they organized a motorcycle maintenance workshop in the diner's parking lot, with Harold as the chief instructor. Young riders from all over the county would come to learn from the veteran who had turned a gang of troublemakers into respected members of the community. Mr. Johnson often remarked that he'd never seen such a change in people. The Thunder Raiders still wore their leather jackets with the lightning bolt and skull, but now they had added a small American flag pin, identical to Harold's, on their collars. They had earned the right to wear it by showing the same respect for their machines and others that Harold had taught them. Even the diner itself had been transformed. The walls now displayed photographs of Harold with his new brotherhood of riders, alongside his old military pictures. Jenny's daughter had created a special display case for Harold's Ghost Riders memorabilia, which had become a point of pride for everyone. On quiet mornings, when Harold sat in his corner booth drinking his coffee, you would sometimes catch Sarah's eye and smile. They both knew that sometimes the greatest victories in life don't come from defeating others, but from teaching them to see the world differently. The Thunder Raiders had learned more than just motorcycle skills. They had learned about honor, respect, and the timeless bond that can form between riders of any age. As Harold watched the morning sun reflect off the line of motorcycles outside the diner, he knew that his legacy would live on through these young riders. They had become more than just students or friends. They had become a new kind of family, bound together by respect for the past and hope for the future.